ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for today's Infopedia web conference, Dynamics 365 Fast Track Tech Talk. Today's topic is data migration, presented by Goncalo Antunes, Senior Fast Track Program Manager with Microsoft. Goncalo, you now have the floor. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Otto. Thanks and good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending from where you're attending. For me, it's actually good afternoon. I'm sitting in sunny Lisbon, Portugal, and working from here. So Otto introduced myself already. Goncalo Antunes, I'm a program manager with the Fast Track team within the Dynamics 365 product group, and been in the company for about 8 years. Most of my time, I don't want to say all, but most of my time in Dynamics or in CRM, as we used to call it, and just about a year or so joining the Dynamics 365 product group, and been actively working as my other colleagues in delivering the Fast Track program to our customers throughout during their projects, basically. So the topic today, like Otto mentioned, is on data migration. So we're gonna have a tech talk about data migration to Dynamics 365 online. Okay, so this is about online because naturally some of the things could be a little bit different if we were still talking about on-premises. I also on the line, I should have put his name up there next to mine, but I also got on the line a colleague of mine, Alex Singh. He's also in the same team as me, and he will be helping me out with some of the questions that come during the session. So the idea is this really to make it a flow pretty smoothly, and as you go and have questions, start dropping them in the chat or through the messages tab like Otto instructed you. Alec will be responding them, but in the meantime, if there are some that actually require some more some more information or some more discussion, we're going to leave them to the end. I will make sure that I spare some time in the end of the session for some Q&A. So with no further delays, I'm going to jump to the first, or actually to the agenda and the objectives for today. So we're going to take roughly 2 hours. We may take a little bit less, but intend not to go over to 2 hours, I promise. And start with, first of all, an overview about data migration. Not necessarily or not so specific to Dynamics 365, or naturally pointing in that direction, but you could take this first section as a general data migration open mind discussion, sort of saying, to plan your data migration processes within your project or within any of your IT projects. Perhaps it's nothing. It is just common sense in some situations, but it's always good to put it all in one place in a couple of slides where people can actually map that to their real scenario and see how they can make it happen that easily and that straightforward. Secondly, we're going to touch a little bit about different data sources, eventually transformation that you need to do with that data that you're bringing from different systems before you actually load it or upload it or transfer it, whatever you want to call it, to Dynamics 365 online. And naturally, with that, which would be the tips, or which would be the things to look after to optimize the process, and what are the common challenges and some known constraints that we still have got, but naturally we're going to provide you some tips and some recommended practices to help you proceed and at least to give you a good quick start on that process. The idea is not to go through a detailed practical session today, more on a go through every single piece of thing that you need to cover, let's say, to achieve a successful data migration. And naturally, as I mentioned lastly there, we're going to spare some time for some Q&A to make sure that we answer your questions. But all in all, I mean, even if you don't have enough questions covered today, working with our fast-track program managers or with myself or Alok, you're always welcome to bring any of your questions to us or to our fast-track program manager to make sure that that concern is addressed or that question has got an answer or that you actually have all what you need to migrate your data successfully. So kind of an open question, but yeah, why do we need to migrate data, right? So as an example scenario here, starting from the left side of the slide, we may want to migrate data because we want to have a 360 degrees view of the customer, right? So that's actually oftenly the starting point for the discussion on why do I need to migrate the data and what do I actually need to migrate? And then jumping to the next step there about having all data in one place. So the perception of having or in order to have a 360 degrees view, as in this example of a customer, you may or you would require to have all the data accessible in one place, right? Or perceived, at least, that the data is there in the same place. But that does not necessarily mean that all data must be in Dynamics 365, right? So viewing all data in Dynamics 365 or even in other systems that we're covering here, Dynamics 365, may be or is commonly different than storing all the data in Dynamics 365. So with that said, basically, it actually kicks off a broader discussion, which I want to touch base with you today during the session, which is what sort of considerations and what sort of things you should look after in order to achieve the best and most successful migration of your data to Dynamics 365, right? First of all, and even before I go to the next slides and before I go on considerations there, I would say the first question is really what exactly do you need to migrate? Do you actually need to migrate all the data in terms of historical data, in terms of data that is actually not really needed to be stored in Dynamics 365? You can quickly come up or design a very simple way to have that data displayed or just accessible by clicking another link and have another screen popping up and showing that data that you actually need your users to consume while they're working with the system, right? Like I mentioned, this may just sound like common sense, and it is actually, but based on our experience and seeing what we've seen in the different projects within Dynamics 365, we have seen several situations where people don't go back to these basics and actually just, I'm going to migrate everything that I've got and then end up in consuming a lot of storage, actually storage that perhaps they actually don't need to consume, and even considering scalability and growth and even costs, if you want to talk about costs, that's not really effective. And if you want to make it successful from the first moment, then definitely a good starting point for the discussion is why and what do I need to migrate exactly. And to have that discussion with your business stakeholders or with your technicians, we would throw a few considerations here. Not after you've gone through that part of okay, I've got exactly the data set that I want to migrate, then we would start with data cleansing, right? Data cleansing, I mean, here is if you've got a source system, even if it's Dynamics 365 on premises, or if it's another third-party system, doesn't matter. But if you've got a data set full of, let me call it garbage, quote unquote, if you migrate it as it is, then you're going to migrate garbage as well, right? So the idea is that you're in the sweet spot to do that data cleansing. Data cleansing may just mean cleaning up duplicates, removing or not migrating some fields that, you know, they're just there for historical purposes, or they're just there because, you know, initially that source system had the field and people would just drop some notes there, and then actually you don't need them in Dynamics 365. So make that let's say exercise and prepare and understand what sort of data cleansing actions you would need to know, or you would need to do to make sure that all the data that you migrate is actually cleaned up and really spot on as you need it. The second one would be on data transformation. So it's very common to transform that data. So commonly the data coming from the source system does not really represent exactly how it's going to show in Dynamics 365. So with that said, you may have heard about ETL processes, so extract, transform and load processes, bringing data from different systems, transforming it, even if it's consolidating data, trimming, concatenating, whatever it is. That is something that you will have to consider within this data migration process. The third one on the list, one time, n times, and first sync run. What I mean with this is, how are you planning to do that data migration? And that actually connects with the fourth bullet there about data volume. So if you're gonna plan to migrate all your data in let's say in a weekend or in a few hours, perhaps you'll be fine if we're just talking about a few records or several hundreds of records, or a few thousands, let's say, or something. But something that potentially and realistically if you could do that in that time frame, that's fine, brilliant, and you're good to go. So it's a one-shot, one-time migration, and you're done. But in many situations, especially in larger organizations or in organizations where you've got already a large data set or a considerable volume of data to migrate, you may want to consider the multiple times run of this process. Multiple times means that you would go on a first run, so first sync run, that's what I mentioned there, and perhaps, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks before you do that first run, that's going to take like perhaps a couple of days to complete eventually, but you will bring, let's say, 5 million accounts and 20 million opportunities and X number of other records that you potentially could not afford to migrate in that time frame that you had planned, let's say over the weekend that you had planned to do the full migration. So if you can't afford to have that full migration in one shot, in one day, or just, if you're flipping the switch from the old system to the new system from one day to the other, or from Friday to Monday, you have a reduced time frame to migrate your data, right? So either you do it and you can afford to do it, or if you can't afford to do it due to time constraints, then definitely go for the multiple times approach, which usually is as simple as migrating a big chunk of data, or the largest chunk of data, let's say until end of March, let's say, potentially, or end of April, end of last month, all that data. And then just before you go live on that weekend or on the day before, on the night before, eventually, you will do you're going to run that other time, the kind of the delta migration. So migrating only the things that were created, modified, or potentially deleted since the first run of that data migration process. So that's, again, may sound like common sense, but definitely a recommended practice to have in mind, especially when you're talking about larger volumes of data. The other topics below, just on storage and scalability, I kind of touched base on them already in terms of growth of the database, growth of your storage consumption. I'm growing 2 gigabytes per year. So how is it going to look like in a 10 years time frame? Or actually, I'm growing 2 gigabytes a year, but my business is growing 20% a year. So eventually, I'm going to grow even more than 2 gigabytes a year. And how will that reflect? Potentially, kind of as a rule of thumb, how is that going to reflect in my storage consumption, and how is that going to cost me? Basically, how much that's going to cost me? Just a kind of a heads up on that topic as well, just in case you forget. And the last one on compliance and the regulations as well. Naturally, we do have in Dynamics 365 and our cloud technologies and services compliance in place, and several many documentations. We've got the Trust Center that actually provides you all that information if you're concerned about compliance and regulation, having your data up in the cloud. Just go through that on our Trust Center, Dynamics Trust Center, or Azure Trust Center, or Office 365. Go through that, double check, and reach out to your fast track program manager just to be sure that everything is ready. And if you've got any concerns, share those with us, and we'll address them and make sure that everything is as you need it to be. So I've talked a lot just in one slide, just kind of initiate the discussion and bring you to the core of this Tech Talk today. And now in the next slide, I'm going to actually cover a little bit more practical thing rather than just this one slide, which is more general, more an overview of what that data migration looks like. So let me just move forward. And start with data sources, data transformation, and loading. So what do I mean with that? First of all, bringing data from multiple sources. So it will be, I must say, or it is very common to bring data to be migrated to Dynamics 365 from all different from multiple sources, from multiple and different sources, let's say. I've got a few examples there in the screen with different technologies, more or less complex, but independently from that, what you need to have in mind firstly, and that's actually those 4 bullets there, is to build up a data dictionary or let's say data model, and have it well defined just before you go through that process. Don't just go ahead and map all the fields and migrate everything. Make sure you write it down. You do a good schematics of how the data dictionary looks like in the source. How do you want it, or how do you need it to be in the destination system in Dynamics 365? And then find those rules so that the intermediate step between the sources, bringing data from the sources, and having the data already stored in Dynamics 365. So find those, work very deeply in those rules to consolidate that data consistently and in a meaningful way to make sure the data is actually reflecting what you need the data to look like. And for that, we definitely also recommend the third bullet there: leverage an import or a staging database to do that job, basically. It's for ETL. So ETL, I mentioned extract, transform, and load. So basically, to have that intermediate, that staging area where you're bringing data from the different systems into one place. In that place, you can manipulate that data, you can clean that data, you can transform it, and then only migrate exactly what you need to migrate to Dynamics 365. And at that point of time, you can also determine exactly, or refresh your mind again and determine exactly what you need to migrate to Dynamics 365 versus what you just need to see or to visualize from within Dynamics 365, right? One thing may be different from the other, right? So with that said, basically, or with this set in place, I would say you've got a good starting point to your data migration process, regardless of the tools that you're using. And actually, I forgot to mention, but during the Tech Talk today, I will be agnostic to the tooling that you may be using, okay? And from one hand, I'm actually happy to say that, because I'm going to be, let's say, being agnostic, and I'm not going to try to influence you in going in a certain direction. But on the other hand, I'm a little bit unhappy, but I also must say it, and you might know it as well, that we don't have as of today a specific or recommended, let's say, proprietary or third-party tool to migrate data as it is to Dynamics 365. We are working on it. We do have a data loader that is under preview programming under the lifecycle services in our platform. But it does still have some gaps to be filled, and in the meantime, we are also investing some time in and efforts to have potentially if you're coming from Dynamics 365 on premises, to easily or easier, in an easier way, migrate to online. And so eventually, as an ultimate goal, I would love for you to just, if you're in that situation, just to provide the database or put the database in some other place, click a few buttons, and the database would be migrated to Dynamics 365 Online. That would be my ultimate goal, and I would really love to see that, and I'm sure you would love to have that too if you're coming from Dynamics 365 on premises. But anyway, we're not there yet, and with that said, like I mentioned, the data migration tech talk today is tooling agnostic. I'm not going to cover any specifics. If you have specifics, if you want to drop in the chat some questions about those, we can answer. We can share our experience in the projects we've got with the different third-party tools that you may be using, but we can't really, unfortunately, recommend you one because we would be, selling that piece of software for third parties, and that is not our goal. We don't have a partnership as such to do that kind of job. So again, starting with that cleansing process, and cleansing and actually it's cleansing and transformation. I put it all in one bucket here in this slide. But again, putting a kind of a checklist format. What do I mean with clean data, or remove or ignore all data before you actually migrate it? So ensure that you run through that process or do that analysis in the sense of removing duplicates or getting rid or ignoring, or even, I don't know, just don't migrate all data and all data quote unquote, because you may actually need, due to several regulations or compliance rules, you may need to have all the historical data in the system stored in the same place. And I mean, if that is the case, then you've got your answer already, and you can skip that item there in the bullet list. Check for missing required fields and null or missing references. What I mean with this is, so having in mind the Dynamics 365 data model that you've previously consolidated, what are the required fields that you're missing in, let's say, in the source data that you need to clean up, or even check if the data is actually ready or containing everything, or all the records contain all those required fields, and if you don't have any missing references for other fields that you're going to map. And then also define and resolve the uniqueness of records. So this kind of connected with the first one on removing duplicates, but in the sense that you may want to steer in a different direction and actually determine at this point of time what will be your criteria for uniqueness of the record, right? And with that said, you are in the sweet spot to do that job. And then transforming, mapping and transforming, so ensure a proper mapping of that data from the source system and then through a potential transformation step and then to the destination system, that mapping is properly done. Don't just guess, don't just do it and migrate all the data. I would say do a simple or a small set of data. Do it, migrate it, test the mapping, see if everything is clear, validated, and then take it from there. Right? If all is really properly mapped, then you're ready to go. And then jumping to that transforming box there, formatting and ranging, mapping, doing calculations of fields coming from multiple sources, defining the different cascading or relationships between those records from different tables, different systems, converting, filtering, or even enriching that data. Oftenly we actually may forget about enriching data, but it's as important, I would say, as doing cleansing, because again, you're in the sweet spot to do as much as you want or as much as you can before you actually migrate your data. So let's say that in certain situations you may want to query postcodes or validate postcodes from your customer addresses. So you're going to query an external system with the post office for potentially to enrich that customer address base that you've got and populate it with the proper postcode that it's coming from the post office organization, from the post company, exactly to make sure that you've got more data, that you enrich your data set just before you migrate it. So bottom line, do as much as you can before you actually send data to Dynamics 365. Make that data adapt the target schema. I'm not saying that you should keep the Dynamics 365 schema as it is out of the box. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that once you've got the data model in place in Dynamics 365 with the multiple different customized or even custom entities and fields, once you've got all of that set, then definitely make sure that your data is really coming kind of as a direct mapping, one to one field to the other, exactly from that staging area to Dynamics 365. Idea here is to, as much as you can, and in order to reduce the migration times, do the pre-processing, the transformation, all of those things that I've got there in the screen before you actually send the data to Dynamics 365. And sending data to Dynamics 365 will be all about web services, as you might know already. So when we're talking about web services, then definitely we're talking about going through the internet channel. We're talking about sending batches or sending single records across the wire, and living or having to live with a network latency higher or lower depending on where you're sitting, on where your system is sitting, but you're not in the local network anymore. Basically, that's what I want to say. And with that said, so do as much as you can, send the data exactly as it is, ready to be mapped, and then avoid or do as much processing and transformation as you can before you send it to Dynamics 365. But you could potentially send it. I'm not trying to avoid you to send data to Dynamics 365 and then trigger a workflow or some sort of plugin to transform that data. I'm not trying to avoid you to do that, but I'm recommending you to make as much as you can of these pieces of these steps before you actually send the data to Dynamics 365. If you still have to run workflows after a certain contact is created, after an account is created, plugin will trigger and will run some other things. If you can't get away from that, fine, keep it and use it. Just be aware that it may contribute in terms of time-consuming tasks or post-processing tasks to your data migration process. That's the only thing that I want to highlight from this slide. And then moving along on the loading data, so I've covered the extract or bringing data from multiple sources, and then the transformation, which covers cleansing and transforming, and then finally loading data, which I actually already mentioned before. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but basically prepare for that initial data migration. So if you're going to do one initial one, which is going to bring most of your data in, and then you're going to do the delta, let's say, the smaller ones, the second and the first and next iterations, let's say. Prepare for that, define a cutover plan. So when exactly is the cutover date and time for those data migration steps or rounds, let's say, and take it from there. It's not that hard to set up such a plan. Just do it, and you'll be good to go. And then moving data in practical terms will actually you will have to consider or you should consider, actually, I prefer to say that, several other things to have in mind. So looking at the figures there, you will have configuration data that's commonly known as not real data like customer names and customer contacts, but eventually your teams created, team memberships, which user belongs to which team in your organization, postcodes. For instance, you may want to say that you've got an option set for your postcode or the state or the city. You may want to migrate that data upfront as kind of as a separate initial preloading step, because it's considered configuration data. So it's data that actually you need it to be there in order for your real data, let's call it customer data or sales data, to be consistent and to make sense. That actually connects with then with the other gears there on parent entities and child entities, which actually have to be looked after and well defined exactly how you're going to migrate, right? Because that's going to influence and contribute also as well for the complexity or for the time it will take for you to migrate your data. Okay? What I mean with that is make use of the staging approach that I've just mentioned before to resolve lookup records. Lookup records, I mean references to parent or child records, if you want, depending on the way you want to see it. If you can leverage and make use of staging to pre-populate those fields, go ahead and do it. And basically, because when you're migrating that data, you'll be ready to go, and you don't need to go through 2 or 3 rounds of the same process just to make sure that parent and children records are let's say connected between each other. So prepare that migration order, and with that means that typically you would create the parent records first and then migrate the child records after, already with the parent preset or let's say stored. That actually, you could do it in another way, which would be migrate the child records first, but then you could not reference the parent records because they don't exist in the system yet. They were not migrated yet. And then you would have to go and migrate the parent records, and then you would have to go and process or update the child records to reference the parent record. Basically, that's why we recommend you to migrate the parent records first and then child records after, already with the parent preset, and then you're good to go. Basically, you're saving one additional step there in the process to save some time, whenever possible, of course. And then also owner and statuses. So whenever possible, whenever that can be set from the first moment when you're migrating your data, do it. Make sure that you actually have it as is, or with, let's say, it's very common for you to migrate to use a let's call it a service account or one specific account to run the migration job. But you may or you will want for sure to have let's say account records connected to the actual owning users of those records, and not have all the data owned by the service account which did the migration, right? With that said, plan for that, map accordingly, make use of the tooling that allows you to do that. So I'm thinking of SDK and code they create on behalf of owner ID, all of that comes into play at this stage. Make sure that you pre-populate and preset all of that because you will be saving time in the end of the day, let's say. And then lastly, there, thinking of time it takes and kind of speed of the process, scale out the process to multiple threads, and eventually split those by logical entity types. What I mean with this is you may actually create different threads for or different splits of your data migration process, because logically some of the data is actually not really connected. I'm thinking, as an example, you may want to perhaps migrate, say, accounts first. That's fine, accounts and contacts, and then after you're going to migrate potentially sales opportunities, which will contain products and all of that. You may have that in one thread or one stream. And on the other stream, you may want to migrate service data, such as cases and service activities and all of that. So you may want to, you can or you could potentially split that from a logical standpoint in order to make the process more efficient. And thinking of making the process more efficient, that actually introduces the next section on optimizing the process, and which starts basically with again bringing the 3 layers, let's say, of the process that I mentioned on sources, staging or transforming data, and then finally Dynamics 365. Right? How to optimize, how to make it run smoother and more efficiently. So seek for improvement areas. This is maybe just a broader statement, but it's actually looking for improvement and seeking for continuous improvement, let's say, in that process. Don't just take the first version of it as it is. You may find different areas where you actually can make things in a different way. Maybe you can skip one of the steps that you had planned initially, and with that you're just going to reduce a couple of hours of migration time, as an example, if you're time constrained. And for that, typically, the focus will be on the staging and transforming area, so that middle box there. And knowing your tooling, or knowing the capabilities and the possibilities that your tooling allows you to put in place is, I would say, crucial. Like I said, I would love to bring you one tool here that we have, or that we would have for you, but we don't have it yet. But with that said, basically, focus in knowing a little bit more of your tooling. If you just purchased it, reach out to that provider, to that software provider, ask for specific recommendations on how to implement or how to set up the tool to make better use, or how to set up the tool to migrate data in a faster way, in a better way to Dynamics 365. I am sure that provider will give you a lot of insights on how to set it up. If not, just query or work with us, Microsoft, for further improvements. From the platform side as well, as Fast Track Program Managers, we are able to work with you as well to I'm going to say it, tweak and tune that process from the platform end. There are some things that we could do for you, and so bring that scenario of yours to us, and we will make sure that we can address those concerns or those limitations, and let you migrate in a, let's call it, in a smoother and faster way. So I'm just going to have a piece of water. Thank you. And with that said, and touching a little bit the migration flow. So I mentioned the one-time migration or the multiple iterations of that migration, and also how you're gonna split that logical entity by logical entity types whenever it makes sense. But anyway, starting or focusing in that migration approach, do I do it in one shot? Do I do it in multiple shots with the deltas? If that is the case, if I'm doing multiple iterations, so leverage and make sure that you leverage what the API allows you to do in order to be more efficient. That means that, as an example, when you're creating a record, and if that record already exists, you may want to if you're not allowing duplicates to be stored in Dynamics 365, then you're going to get a response saying, hey, based on the duplicate detection criteria, your record already exists, right? And you get a response back, and you have to treat that response. Okay, so if it exists, I don't want to do anything with it, or I want to just update the existing one. Or you can make use of the upsert message within the API. So if you're a programmer, I don't want to go too deep because I'm not aware of your profile and skill sets. So with that said, I'm just gonna scratch the surface on this topic. But you can use upsert, which will actually do that work. So if you, instead of explicitly saying create record A, and then if record A exists, the platform is going to provide you a response saying, hey, record A exists, there's an error. And then you're going to have to determine, okay, if it exists, I want to apply it instead. If you use the upsert message, the platform will do that job for you, basically. So, hey, I want to upsert record A. So the platform will take that message and say, okay, I'm creating the record. If the record exists, that's fine. I'm just going to update it. And there is no error. There's just a response saying, hey, the record was properly updated or upserted in that sense. So that's something that you can use, but as you can imagine from the platform end, it will require some additional processing time to provide you a response. And if you're, let's say, constrained in time, you may want to do that conditional split before you actually send the data through the web services to Dynamics 365. And how can you do that? So as an example, as a sample example, let's say, like I have it here. So is it the first import that I'm running? Well, if the answer is yes, then there's no doubt the destination system is empty. So you can clearly go ahead and just use the create message within the API, which will be faster, and it will just create the record in the shortest time possible. But if you know that it's not the first one, and there is a likelihood that you're going to have some records or plenty of records that exist already, then you may want to do that conditional split and acknowledge or determine, okay, well, I'm quite sure this record does not exist based on my criteria, my cutover plan. Because of this, I'm going to use the create message. But for the other ones, because I know they exist already, or potentially, or it's likely that they exist already, I'm going to use the update message instead. And that would just be optimizing and making that process even more efficient at the API levels. If you're talking with, or if you're a developer, or if you're really at the lowest level of the migration process, dealing with these little details, this will make a difference in the end of the day. The other thing that we would recommend you to do would be on make use of load distributors, multi-threading, and execute multiple requests. Load distributors are kind of touching what I mentioned already before in terms of conditional splits, or even potentially splitting load across different streams, different processes. One will be migrating, let's say, service data. The other one will be migrating sales data. So if you can distribute that load amongst the different processes or the different buckets, then you're kind of increasing the throughput as well, and optimizing that migration flow. Which actually touches what I just mentioned, which is multi-threading, which will allow you to do that, let's say, parallel multiple processes sending data at the same time to Dynamics 365. So multiple processes meaning multiple entities or threads contacting Dynamics 365 and sending data across. Which eventually or naturally will make the migration faster, as opposite when compared with if you were just using one or two processes as an example. The last one that I mentioned is execute multiple. So execute multiple actually allows you to batch or to create batches of messages to be sent to Dynamics 365. Let's say that instead of sending one record to be created at a time, so I do a web service call with a create record A message, or record one, let's say, record one message. Instead of creating one with that, another thread sending record 10, and the other one sending record 20. Instead of that, I could package, create batches of multiple sizes, or of a larger size up to 1,000, that's what we are allowing, of records to be created in one web service call. That means that basically I'm going to build that package and send and do the execute multiple call to the web service, and send the full batch with those, let's say, up to 1,000 records to be created in one shot. In one shot, in the sense that records are sent, the platform will handle them one after the other, and basically with that you're saving the round trips back and forth from the Dynamics 365 system to have the create and let's say to have the request and response for all those potentially 1,000 records or 1,000 calls that you would be doing. Just bear in mind one thing, which is the runtime limitation that we've got there for execute multiple. So if you're doing multiple threading with single messages, let's say multiple threading, let's say that you're doing 100 concurrent parallel threads, sending each one of them one record at a time, one create message at a time, or one update message at a time to Dynamics, it's okay. You can have as many multiple threads as you want. But if you're doing those batches that I just mentioned, we're currently limiting the number of let's say concurrent threads doing that type of message. So if you have two threads sending batches of 1,000 records each, contacting Dynamics 365 and sending that data across, it's fine. But if you go above or more, we have more than two concurrent threads that third and fourth and so on will start receiving a message saying server is busy. So this is documented actually. We can share with you that link, and but basically it's labeled as runtime limitations. And that is basically to make sure that we kind of keep within the boundaries of resource utilization, or over utilization of resources if that could potentially impact the platform. But then again, we also recognize that 2 may not be enough, or is likely not enough if we're talking about migrating several millions of records. So with that said, we're happy to work with you as Fast Track Program Manager, or even if you reach out to support, we can relax those parameters and allow you to have more concurrent threads to send data to Dynamics 365 in batches. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind, and please come to us. Don't just say, or don't just experience that migrating data to Dynamics 365 is slow, or it's going to take me 3 weeks based on the speed that I'm getting. It's going to take me 3 weeks to migrate all that data. I don't want to hear that. I really want to bring those weeks down to days or hours, depending on your complexity and data volume, of course. And we are more than able to do that and to help you with that. So with that said, bring those situations to us. So moving along, and all in all, basically, explore those different approaches. Consider that direct mapping. So whenever possible, if you've already have a source system that most of the fields are already kind of direct mappings to the destination system, just use it, or use it for some of the tables that have got that. On the other hand, you may want to consider import and staging database. So import would be kind of bringing data from the multiple sources to one place, and staging would be mentioned more as a data preparation, transformation, cleansing database. You may want to play with all of these, or just with one, or just with none, and migrate all your data accordingly. It really depends on your scenario, and bottom line, basically, explore and pick between those different approaches, which one goes according to your needs in order to achieve that successful data migration process. So now I'm going to cover a little bit what we've got as common challenges that we've seen in the projects. And also some constraints. Actually, I mentioned one already about the execute multiple, so we call it a constraint or a limitation, but there are some more. We're talking here about constraints or limitations in migrating data to Dynamics 365 with the API that we have got today. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. What we will have in the future, in the near or midterm future, may or will likely become better, and some of these limitations will just go away, and that's what we're aiming to do. But this is what we've got today, and I don't want to show you the future because you're perhaps pretty tired of listening to those presentations showing the future. You just want to know what's into it just now. So with that said, that's kind of, common challenges and things that people sometimes talk about is performance of data migration or throughput of data migration, right? So I may be performing very fast in sending data to Dynamics 365, but I'm just doing it in one single thread. and eventually that's not enough. It's just, I'm only getting like 50,000 records per hour or per 4 or 5 hours, which is clearly not enough. So I don't have enough throughput to migrate my data in the determined or in the migration window that I've got. So consider that along with data volume and that migration time that you've got to make sure that you can focus in reducing those months or weeks. I heard about months. Don't be too surprised, but reduce that to days, weeks, or even hours. We managed to have most, if not all, our fast track customers achieving that situation. I can share examples of even some banks migrating data to Dynamics Online in a few days, a couple of days, with several millions of records and opportunities and activities and nodes. So something that initially people would say, I'm not going to go to online because I can't do direct SQL inserts, and with that said, it all has to go through web services, and web services are slow, and it's going to take me forever to migrate data. We don't want that to be an issue anymore. Come to us, work with us, bring your concerns, bring your scenario to your fast track program manager, and we will make sure that we can help you in achieving that goal of migrating data in a timely manner. And then also another common challenge is the migration of some special data or some special fields. I'm going to touch base later on what's, or I'm going to detail a little bit more on what I mean with this, but special data would be, those tables and the potential you can't really insert into Dynamics 365. I'm thinking about audit base as an example. Special fields as, created on, created by. So the owner record, the owner fields, those kind of special fields that need to be handled in a different way. Actually, some of them can't really be touched or have to be migrated in a different way, and that I'm going to mention just after in the next few slides. So if I had to summarize in a kind of quoting some movies, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good of the data migration process, and definitely good things that you can and should take advantage of, are parallelism, so multi-threads, execute multiple, batching those records, and the staging, right? So transforming, staging your data before you actually migrate it to Dynamics 365. The bad, and they all have quotes, so don't take it that seriously. I'm just kind of playing a little bit with the words here. But the bad would be that some pieces of data can't really be migrated. I'm thinking of team membership, so you can't, it is a separate table that it's kind of a table that contains relationships between other tables, so which user belongs to which team, so that's not actually real data that you could migrate as account data, for instance, or contact data. System jobs and audit data as well are something that we would potentially, or you cannot really migrate it as it is. If you're, I'm thinking here specifically now in migrating from Dynamics 365 on-premises or CRM on-premises to Dynamics 365 online. And the ugly, I mean that it is possible, but we do have some restrictions and some special fields, but they can be handled with some alternative methods. So it's not the best thing to have, but it's a bit ugly because of that. But it is doable, and we can help you with that process as well. So and it all comes down to this: so performance, or throughput, right? I may be very fast again, saying the same thing that I just said a couple of minutes ago. I may be very fast in sending my records one at a time to Dynamics 365, but it's like this Ferrari car. It's only kind of a single or two people kind of car, so you can't really send that much data in one shot, right? As opposite to the right hand of the screen, where you have a full highway, multiple lanes, all queued up and all sending data consistently to Dynamics 365. So that this kind of puts together those two pictures of multi-threading and batches of records being sent in order to achieve a higher throughput of data, in this case of cars within the highway. But also have in mind, and don't ever forget, that you will be connecting and going through, ultimately through the internet channel until you finally reach the Dynamics 365 servers. With that said, I just want to mean that you may have during the day an experience that is different than the one you have during the night or potentially even during the weekend. That means that when you're doing that initial testing of migrating your data, kind of a benchmarking, how long is going to take me to migrate all my data? I'm going to try with a small subset of, 100,000 records. It took me half an hour. Oh, brilliant. This is really great stuff. But I did it over the night or during the weekend. Internet channels maybe, let's say, not so busy, or even your corporate channel, internet channel, may not be so busy when compared with business hours on a working day. So do those benchmarks in different times of day or of the week to make sure that you've got a good number to consider, and then to estimate how long it's going to take you to migrate your data. And then if you really need to, again, to go back to the drawing board and again optimize, put more efficiency in that process of yours to migrate your data, or even potentially even rethink the number of iterations that you need to do to migrate your data. So with that said, so dealing with special fields, number one tip here, inactive activity parties and owners. So I'm talking here about users that are inactive or unexisting in the destination system. This is actually quite common. That you could. I'm thinking of companies that are moving from on-premises to online. Let's say in on-premises they've got a CRM for 10 years already, with 5,000 users. 2,000 of them left the company because they retired or because they went to another company. So ultimately, now the number of users that going to Dynamics 365 is only 3,000. But you want to keep that data kind of referenced to the original owner or to the original user, let's say. So for that, we do have a kind of what we call the stub users approach, and I'm gonna touch on that a little bit later after this. But this is tip number one, let's say. The created on field. So if you want to keep the date and time when the record was originally created in the source system, you can't just go and map it to the created on field in Dynamics 365. You must use the overridden created on field instead. Okay, so that the platform will understand that, okay, the person or whoever is sending this record wants to override the created one field, wants to keep the original one, and that's going to happen basically if you map that field as well. GUIDs. So GUIDs are the unique identifiers of records. So that 32-digit and letters, say from A to F, formatted field, which is unique, hopefully, or auto-generated and unique because of that. We could tip you to prefer and maintain those from the source system if you're bringing them from on-premises, but just to avoid additional time to generate or to create that, which is actually very, very reduced. We're talking here about a portion of a milli or microsecond, right? But if we're talking about millions and millions and millions of records being created, maybe it actually reflects in a few minutes or potentially even more. So if you can, or if you want, you can maintain those GUIDs. Just beware and make sure that they are actually unique. That's actually we've seen so often due to unsupported situations, duplicate GUIDs in a system. And because of that, naturally, as you might imagine, inconsistent data and behavior of the application occurred. So that's kind of a side note. Prefer to maintain whenever possible or whenever you really think that it's safe enough to do it. Otherwise, just disregard this last tip here. Next one on created by. So like I mentioned before, you may have you will have a user or an account that will be running the migration tools, and if you don't do anything, basically all the records will be created by that account, and all the records will be owned by that account, and it doesn't look good in the destination system, right? Because of that, you can or you should leverage the usage of create on behalf of, and use the caller ID as being the ID for let's say for keeping or with this basically mapping or referring exactly to the original owner of that record, so that when you're mapping the created by field, you're mapping it with the original owner of the record or the original user who created the record if it exists. But in order to keep that and to use that, you really need to leverage the usage on the API of the create on behalf of and caller ID. State codes. So again, this is for the different situations, for the different entities. You may need to assess how these states, I'm thinking, state codes means, if it's open or closed, active, inactive, assess how or why they should be migrated in the different states. And with that, basically prepare for that migration. So as an example, you could migrate a record as open, and then you would have to run a certain plugin to do something, and then finally close or change the state code to closed just after that in order to have your data as you wish it to be. The modified by and modified on, we currently don't yet allow the mapping of these fields, so this is a constraint, I must say, a limitation. So it would be great to also migrate the who modified this record the last time in the source system, or when was it the last time, or modified the last time, which currently you do that, or you migrate one of those, and then modified on will be naturally the time of the migration, when it was actually migrated or touched the last time. So for that purpose, or for that, to cover that in a gap in an alternative method, we are recommending you to create custom fields and map those times or users to those custom fields, and keep them or keep them in the form, in the entity form and grids, for as an example, or just hide it in the form just for historical purposes if you really need them. That would be our recommendation. And then migrating special entities, just to cover a couple of them. Migrating orders, for instance, from Dynamics on-premises to online. So orders may have different revisions. You may revise an order and then again create another revision and another revision. So the order ID will be the same. So you will have multiple records with the same order ID, but the revision number will be different in the source. So make sure that when you're importing those records, that you import them in sequence, so one revision after the other, so that it actually reflects exactly how it was on the source. And then personal views. Several customers asked me actually about this. How can I migrate my users' personal views? So we've got the system views as you know them, active accounts, open opportunities, all that. But users, one day or the other, they just end up creating their own personal views, and they would like to keep them from on-premises to online, to migrate them as is. You can also migrate these with the usage of the SDK, and again, similar to the approach that I mentioned before on create on behalf of and make use of that caller ID, and the table to migrate, or the records from which table you need to migrate, are the records from the table user query. Okay, bear that in mind. And then the stub users approach, which I mentioned, basically, again, for historical reasons or even compliance and regulation reasons, you may need to keep the original owners or users that created or modified those records in Dynamics 365. So they created it on-prem, and you want to keep or map them in online, but they're not actually real users in the Office 365 portal, right? They're just in Dynamics, they're not created because they don't exist in the portal, they don't have a license assigned, and hence they will not be created in the Dynamics 365 users screen when you log into it. So for that purpose, you can actually create what we call stub users. So you can actually import through the UI an Excel sheet, a file with a list of users. So username, name, all the information that you've got in the user form. Or you can create these via the API as well, through the software development kit or any tooling that you've got. And those users will be created in Dynamics 365 only, okay? That allows you to migrate data and reference those users all across the data set that you've got. Just bear in mind one thing, is that automatically, out of the box, by default, as you want to call it, these users created by this process or via this process will have assigned the salesperson role, the out-of-the-box one. If you got rid of it, you must, and you want to make use of this, you must import it back and have it restored in this instance, basically. And if you want to make sure that you can migrate data to, kind of as a last tip there, if you want to migrate data to these inactive and unexisting users You want to keep them as owners of those records for different reasons. Imagine it's a case record, right? A salesperson role or a user with a salesperson role may not have the permissions or the privileges to create a case record, right? With that said, the tip here is to provide higher privileges to that out-of-the-box role, even if it's temporarily. You just go there, increase the privileges, migrate data, and then you can take it off, take the privileges off, or just use this out-of-the-box salesperson role only for this purpose, as an example. Okay, that's a good tip, and must say that we've used it several times in our different customers. And then to finish with, top of mind recommended practices for the whole process, even in tooling and configuration and code and all of that. I'm going to touch in a few of them. So starting with settings, disable in Dynamics, as you might know, disable the duplicate detection rules. If possible, if you don't need to, if you've done that job in removing duplicates before, just go ahead and remove or deactivate and disable the duplicate detection system, because otherwise there will be some additional processing time for this particular action. So, and that taking time naturally will contribute for your overall data migration process and how long it's going to take. Naturally as well, in order to avoid the processing or let's say synchronous processing during data migration, whenever possible, disable workflows and plugins as well in the system. So imagine that, so if you're creating an account and you've got a synchronous workflow or a plugin running just on the creator of the account, this piece of code or this workflow will run once the record is created, once the record is migrated, and only after this let's say this piece of code or this workflow steps run, finally the response is provided saying, hey, okay, record is created, and you can go ahead and create the next ones. Thirdly, third on that list, disable auditing, also commonly left enabled during migration times. I mean, if you really require, if it's for compliance or regulation purposes, keep it, of course, but we can't really do much about that. I would perhaps just recommend you to reduce it to the bare minimum in terms of fields that you need to audit. Don't try to avoid auditing all the fields whenever possible, or disable auditing completely, even if it's on just during migration time. Also, deactivate activity feeds during import. So activity feeds is actually part of the product, and you might recognize the name. Basically, it will say that, hey, user A created an activity related with this account or contact. So this is something that triggers, that runs in the format of plugins in the systems. So whenever you're migrating data, these steps, these pieces of code will run as well. And with that said, if you don't need it, and if actually it will be meaningful pointless information to have activity feeds set as on during the import time. So with that said, take into consideration disabling it or deactivating it completely. And then review roll-up fields. What do I mean with this? Basically, if you've got roll-up fields in your solution, which I assume you will, roll-up fields will have roll-up or let's say mass calculation jobs for those roll-up fields running 12 hours after let's say the main import, or every several hours after the import. I think the default is set to 12, and then you can go there to that mass calculation job and reset the schedule to a different time or to a different recurrency to make sure that it's not running during your data migration, just to avoid over processing or slower access to those tables that you're touching on at that point of time. I'm not sure if you're throwing any questions in the chat, but if you're not, please feel free to do so. We're gonna reply as we go, but also in the very end, keep throwing those questions, and we're gonna stop for a moment for Q&A just before we close the session. Again, next, in terms of recommended practices, talking about the platform or the platform on your end, let's say, before you touch the Dynamics 365 platform. Leverage, again, never get tired of saying it, leverage staging, but also if you can, if you want, it will be very, very positive to host that tooling or that staging database in our infrastructure as a service, let's say Azure systems, in the format of a virtual machine or even a SQL Azure database within the same location or the same region, let's say. Don't just have your instances hosted out of the US or out of the EMEA and have your Azure virtual machine hosted in Asia. That will not be the best scenario to consider. Try to deploy within the same or to the closest region, if not the same, in order to make sure that it runs as fast as possible. And then the last one, when we're talking about really increasing and trimming the fringes of improving the time and improving the times of migration, if you're running that tooling with that service account, because all the datetime fields will be stored in the database in UTC format, you may also want to consider setting the regional settings of that service account to UTC as well. With that, you're basically reducing, again, a portion of milli or microseconds, but again, contributing for the overall objective, which is to migrate as fast as possible. And then on SDK and tooling, I mentioned it a little bit already, but touching a little bit on the possibilities of your tooling. So know your tooling, assess before you actually purchase or pick or develop a tool to migrate your data. Make use of parallelism, multi-threading, especially if you're doing single requests, again, like I mentioned, but and also leverage execute multiple requests, so creating those batches. So fine-tune the batch size. We allow up to 1,000 as a batch size, but you may want to reduce that to 300, 200, 500. Try to find the sweet spot. Depends on the entity complexity. So you may want to migrate complex entities with a lower batch size, with a smaller batch size, but you may want to migrate some others with a larger batch size because the entities are very, pretty simple, just plain, few plain fields, no lookups, no nothing, just plain fields. And then leverage upsert only when necessary. Again, I mentioned if you can do that conditional split, like I mentioned before, go ahead and do it. If not, then definitely go for upserts. And if you're using upserts, you're going to have to use alternate keys that I mentioned here. And alternate keys would basically be a way to determine the uniqueness of your record and whether or not it's considered a duplicate. And also bringing alternate keys to the plate will kind of help you as well in the sense of mapping and keeping that uniqueness of records from the source systems down all the way up to Dynamics 365. Basically, you imagine a customer number as an example coming from the source system, or that you really want to keep it as customer number and not as account number in Dynamics 365. So you may want to set up alternate key on customer number, and when you're migrating that data, it will be for sure that will be unique. Or you may want to set the phone number as an alternate key to make sure that one is unique as well, and so on and so forth. Same thing or similar thing with the usage of other recommended SDK messages, such as assign. Older ones are assign and set state. Newer ones will be update. So before, whenever you wanted to update a record and then change the owner of the record and then change the status or the state of the record, you would have to do that in three different operations: one update, one assign, and one set state. Now you can do it all in one shot. If you assign the value of the modify the fields that you want to modify, assign the value of the owner field with the new owner, assign the value of the new state code with the new state code, and then do one call with the update message. Everything will be done in one shot on the platform, and then you don't have to do it in three shots like I just mentioned. And then also update only the columns that you need. So meaning that it's kind of this if we go back to SQL Server and thinking about am I doing a select star from table 1, actually I just need columns A and B, so why don't I just do select A and A, comma B from table 1? Much faster, less columns to retrieve, less columns to update. When we're talking about updates instead of retrieving, be fussy and be very, very detailed, and if you want to really make it really effective and optimized, go and at this level of detail and make use of all these tips and tricks, and I am sure that you will be able to achieve a fast and successful data migration. The last one I mentioned already on the grid, so I'm not going to repeat again. And then an example of an example scenario or a scenario of execute multiple requests that I mentioned before, comparing and contrasting the different scenarios. So test case would be I want to create 10 or even 20,000 sample records from different entities in two different approaches. So single request, like I said, every time that I send a record is one web service call. So I may want, or you should, we recommend you to leverage multi-threading, so you can leverage up to 10, 20, or even 100 or more concurrent threads doing that. So, and with that said, you can send those 10, 20,000 records quickly. Or you can use execute multiple and create batches of records and also make use of multiple threads. Just beware that the boundaries or the runtime limitations are set to 2, and if you're using more, you will get that error saying that server is busy. That's just an example of the different approaches or that you can take to migrate your data successfully. Just moving, we're almost done, actually, 4 slides to go. Alternate keys and upserts. I'm not going to take too long in here, but basically alternate keys, like I mentioned before, will be that way of determining an alternate key, so a field that will be considered unique, kind of as an index, a key in the table, that will allow you to use upserts. So upserts meaning that I don't care if the record, or I don't know if the record exists already or not in the destination, and because of that I use upserts, and then the platform will handle, and this is basically how the platform handles it. If the record exists already, then it will do an update instead. So that's the branch on the left. If the record does not exist, then it goes through the branch on the right and goes through it basically, and returns in the last bottom box there the response of the upsert message sent to the platform basically. And then runtime limitations. This is what I mentioned in the platform itself. Execute multiple. And batch size, so these are the known ones. So batch sizes we're allowing up to 1,000. I can say that it's more than enough. Sweet spot, based on my experience, has been around, or some number between 200, 300, sometimes up to 500 in very few situations, based on my experience. Number of concurrent threads executing or running execute multiple messages is 2. It's low, we know, not slow, low. It's a low number. It may not be enough for you. So with that said, work with your fast track program manager to see how can we work and relax this parameter and allow you to achieve better numbers if you're really constrained in time. In terms of .NET recommended practices as well. So I'm talking. I don't want to be talking too much development, but I must touch a few terms here. Basically, the first one is actually very, very common to see. Most of the well-known or the best performing data migration tools already have this change in place, so you don't have to do anything. But if you're using another one, or if you're building your own code, your own tool to migrate your data, beware that the .NET framework actually has a limit of number of connections per process of 2. Again, a very low number, which really reduces creates a huge bottleneck in terms of number of connections that you can achieve to send data to Dynamics 365. So this can be overran by changing an element in a config file next to your executable, which is the max connection parameter. And I mean, if you look it up on the web, it's all across the web on how to do this. If you still have doubts, we are more than happy to help you. And then the expect 100 continue on connection. So basically, this is to do with not using it, in the sense that if you're recurrently running your piece of code to migrate your data, you're kind of trusting, by default, you're trusting that connection is open, and you actually send a request and you wait for the response, and all of that. So you're kind of expecting a response in order to send another request. But if you're confident enough and if you want to be more effective, more efficient, you can turn off this particular .NET parameter, and with that said, basically you'll be throwing web service calls one after the other and not caring about waiting for the responses before sending the next one. And then naturally, I don't want to spend too much time there on those last ones, but basically very specific on the utilization of initialization tasks, service channel, thread safety, context token exhaustion. So if it's expire the token and you need to refurbish it again or build it up again before you connect again. Be aware of all that and the disposal of service channels as well as you use them. Basically, this is it's very deep into .NET and to perhaps too much for some of the situations that you're handling, but we really wanted to cover it all in this data migration tech talk, which I did. So I as I promised, I really left some time for Q&A, almost 15 minutes to go. I'm not sure if we had any questions in the chat yet. However, perhaps I throw the question to Otto. Otto, if you can let us know if there were any questions in the chat window from our attendees.
Yeah, it looks like there was one so far, which Alec addressed. But basically, do stub users require a license to be?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Alec addressed that already, right? Yeah. So the answer is no. They don't require a license. So for people for the person who asked the question, you got the answer. But for the others, if you didn't get the answer is no. For creating stub users, you can just go ahead and create them. Consider that they will be created only inside the Dynamics 365 database. They're not created in the portal. Now you could ask, and kind of pulling out of my head a situation that I've got where customers created a bunch of stub users, and after a few months, those users came back to the company, right? So they became actual active users in Active Directory again, and because of that, they wanted to put them as active users in Dynamics 365 as well. How to deal with that? Plain easy. Make sure that when you migrate those inactive users, you keep the UPN, so the user principal name, the email address, and so it will be imported only to Dynamics 365. But later on, imagine that you reactivate that user in the Active Directory. It will be active again in the Office 365 portal. You go to the user and you assign a license to it. As soon as the license is assigned, the user will be created or updated in Dynamics 365. That's how it works. So the system doesn't know yet that you've created the user as a stub user, right? The system, the synchronization mechanism of users from the portal into Dynamics 365. But imagine this particular situation. You reactivated the user in the Active Directory, assign a license to that user in the portal. The synchronization mechanism will create or try to create that user in Dynamics 365. Because the UPN matches, that's why I mentioned the UPN is important to keep. Because the UPN matches, there will be a link established between that user that was originally created as a stub user which actually represents the actual reactivated user in the Active Directory. So the link is established, and eventually you can even rename the UPN afterwards and all of that. You can do that in Active Directory, and the synchronization will happen and will be reflected in Dynamics 365 as well. Okay, that is something I came across a few months ago from a customer, and it is working exactly as I just mentioned. So if you come across that, don't think that it won't work, or don't think that you need to create another user for that purpose. You can make it work with the stub users approach. It's just as I mentioned. Right. So I think I'm done. If there are no questions, Otto, I believe you want to pull up the post for the survey and feedback link. Is it?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Well, and before you leave, folks, please don't leave, and please make sure that you can take a couple of minutes or a minute just to fill in our survey or our feedback to provide your opinion about the session, about the content, about the format. We want to hear from you. We want to know if the content was valuable for you. We want to know if it was good time invested in the session. And naturally, we also want to know room for improvement. So please bring to us your opinion, your feedback, and naturally, we would expect, or we would love to have great feedback and great results in the poll that you will have in front of you, or very shortly in front of you, about this Tech Talk. So if there are no other questions, and I'm going to leave you for today, and wish you the rest of a great day, and really hoping to talk to you in the near future, and have a great day. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you, our audience, for coming out and giving us a listen. We certainly hope that the information has proven useful for you. All materials from today's presentation will be available over on the Infopedia Media website within 48 hours. And with that, that concludes today's web conference. Have a great day.